Cameras live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. It's great that so many of you are out there, including people beyond the UK, I understand, which is fantastic. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, this is one of many events being organised by Invisible Dust over a 3-day period. We're on day 2 now, and it's all under the banner of the Forecast programme, which asks us to consider how we think about the planet's future. And what I really like about this programme is that it involves a wide range of practitioners and thinkers, including artists, scientists, writers, and historians from across the world. And this event is no exception. For today's discussion, we'll be considering the ways in which we can use the past to understand the future. And it's obviously an incredibly rich and expansive topic, and it's probably a bit mad to address it in the space of an hour with 4 speakers, but we're going to make a start with the hope that the discussion will kind of filter through into other events and conversations and maybe forms of action in the future. So just to introduce myself, I'm Jes Fernie. I'm an independent curator and writer, and I'm really pleased to be introducing our 4 speakers today. That's Pat McCabe, Anne Johnson, Miranda Lowe, and Jeremy Della, each of whom will address the question from a very different vantage point through the lens of activism, environmentalism, through to epidemiology, art, post-colonialism, and maybe broader social, medical, historical narratives. So by way of introduction, and specifically for our blind and partially sighted audience members, I'm just going to ask each of our speakers to say their name and where they're joining us from, and to describe their appearance and surroundings. I'll kick off. As I said, I'm Jes Fernie. I'm in my garden shed in Essex in southeast England with a backdrop of books behind me. I have short grey, pretty locked down hair, glasses, and I'm wearing a black jumper. Pat, over to you.
Yeah, greetings to you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Patricia Catherine McCabe, and I'm from Dene Nation. So I'll say She'e'ia, Tachi Nishli, Aro Ashi Bashishchi, Ma'adish Gejna Dashanale, Klauschi Daushiche, Quatausdani Nishli. It's also adopted into the Lakota spiritual way of life and given the name Weyakpa Najin Win. It's Woman Stand Shining. And I'm speaking to you from my mother's house here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the Southwest United States. She just turned 97, and so we've been lockdown buddies for about 1.5 years now, and it's a very special time of life for us over here. So greetings to you from Southwest United States.
Wonderful, thank you, Pat. And of course, it's 6 o'clock in the morning where you are, so double thanks for joining us. Anne, could you just introduce yourself, your name and your description?
Hello, I'm Anne Johnson, and I'm speaking to you from my study in London. I'm sitting in a room which has got a lot of books behind me, but also a very special painting painted by a friend of mine, all about her dreams, and it has 49 little figures in it. Let me see, I'm in my 60s, and I'd like to think it was blonde, but it's not really that colour. Hair, and I'm wearing a turquoise jacket. And greetings to you all from London.
Perfect, thank you. Miranda.
Hi everyone, so I'm Miranda, and I'm sitting in my flat in London, in the UK, and I have no bookcases behind me. I just have a blank wall, which is the cream in colour. I have dark brown skin and black hair, black curly hair, and I'm wearing a jumper that the top half has stripes on, which are a mix of navy and red.
And fabulous pink earrings, I have to add.
That too, I forgot the earrings.
And finally, Jeremy.
Hello, my name's Jeremy Della. I too am in London. It's quite a chilly day here today. I'm sitting in the room where I work. I would call it an office if it was more organized. It's basically like being in a sort of teenager's bedroom, but without the bed, surrounded by my books, by pictures, which are in the background. And I will just move my camera up a little bit. There's a torso behind you, if you can see on the door. It's a cutout, and it's actually a cutout of Rod Stewart. So there we go. There's Rod Stewart in a pink jacket, who's behind me to sort of protect me, basically. I am a middle-aged white male with dark hair, not dyed. It's a little bit grey. Hopefully it won't be too grey or any greyer by the end of this hour, but that's where I am.
Perfect. I'm a bit excited that Rod Stewart is now part of our discussion. That's excellent. Okay, so let me just really briefly frame this discussion. It could obviously be said that we need to look at the past in order to learn what not to do in the future. The kind of logic of capitalism and its insistence on perpetual growth, the entrenched colonial power relations that exist in the world, the dominance of humans over nature, all these things and structures have led us to a point that is pretty obviously untenable, and a point where we're not only causing deep harm to ourselves, but also to the planet and the natural world. But today we are focusing on the positive aspects of looking back, and we'll be asking various questions such as, what can we learn from the ways that indigenous communities have forged a relation to the land and their ancestors? How does COVID-19 sit along the narratives and outcomes of other pandemics, including the Spanish flu and HIV? What steps should museums be taking to enable us to publicly acknowledge our colonial past and decolonize their collections? And maybe how art and artists can help us on this critical path. And our increasingly sophisticated understanding of our relation to nature, each other and the planet has obviously been physically impressed on us over the last year. The pandemic has ensured that we have this kind of bodily sense of these connections, which means that our interdependence is no longer abstract and that the question we're addressing today is urgent rather than nice to know or nice to chat about. And many systems of knowledge are now being challenged. And the most exciting proposition that I've been introduced to in the last 5 years is one we may go on to discuss today, which is the kind of decentering of man in the narrative. So to move beyond the idea that humans are at the top of a hierarchical scale of life on Earth, in which the concept of consciousness trumps all other attributes. So each of our panelists for this event will speak for around 3 minutes, and then we'll go on to have a discussion between us, which will be followed by a discussion with you all. Please feel free to put any questions or responses that you might have in the chat box as we're speaking. It would be really nice to hear from you. So let's get on to the main event. Our first speaker, Pat McCabe, is an activist, artist, writer, and ceremonial leader from the Diné people, based in New Mexico in the southwest of the United States, as we've just heard. She has become a spokesperson for indigenous communities and culture, presenting an impassioned case for a more intuitive, sensorial relation to the land and our bodies that provides a place for every life form. Pat, how can we use the past to understand the future?
Thank you, Jess. So I guess first of all, I just want to make a small disclaimer. I actually can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, but I can share from my teachings and perspectives. So just to say that that's the place that I'm coming from. I guess I should say that my grandparents and parents were taken into Dutch Christian Reformed missionary boarding schools when they were young. And so by the time I came along, my immediate family was not speaking our language or practicing our culture. They were indoctrinated into the church. And so I've been, at about 28 years of age, I started making a journey, I guess you could say, the proverbial journey back home. So I just want to give you that little bit of background before I speak. So this hasn't been a lifelong orientation to life, to the world. And so I say my greatest gift to the world is describing my journey going back home, because I really feel like this is the journey of humanity right now. So what I notice in this journey is that indigenous people's understanding of human history on the planet is much, much longer than Western science acknowledges or has been able to decipher or prove, as we might say. And so we're looking at a lineage of human history of hundreds of thousands of years here. And so what my elders speak about is that we've actually been through many worlds already. So maybe sometimes you hear people, different indigenous peoples talk about the fifth world or the sixth world or the fifth sun or those kinds of terminology. So they're talking about, I mean, I've never heard an elder speak totally definitively about everything that encompasses, but it does seem to say that we have lost worlds before. And my clan grandfather spoke of a world that we lost in the flood. Many cultures describe this massive flood on the planet. And he also described that there was almost like a moral failing, but also just a failure of understanding of what actually it takes to make life thrive here. And so he said that the world that we lost in the flood, we lost because men and women believed that they could live without each other. So we haven't totally resolved that struggle in this world that we're in now. And this is part of the issue. But I'm also going to say, so that's a little bit of context of how I think about the past and the future. But also I was invited to be a part of the amazing News Story Summit that took place at Findhorn in 2014. And so there was a gathering of peoples from all over the world, about 350 people, indigenous peoples of all professions. And I think the idea was that if we could all come together, that we're always operating out of a story, but the story we're operating out of right now is not a good one. It's not leading where we want to go. It's leading to death. And so if we could understand what would be the elements of a new story that we would want to live out of, then what would that be? So it was an amazing gathering, chaos, tears, but really, really necessary and beautiful also. But just briefly, and during one of the chaotic parts of it that I just had to step outside and go sit in the dunes for a bit, what my spirit helpers came to me and said is, rather than tell a new story from this point forward, you would be better off retelling the old story. And if you went back and retold the old story, you would automatically change the trajectory into the future. So this is a principle that has been guiding my work, since then, so just for about the last 7 years. And different points in human history have been pointed out to me that are called archetypal woundings of humanity. And I've been given some instruction about how to address these places it's kind of reframing and re-understanding the stories, but also combining that with our newfound passion for wanting to understand really what is it that causes life to thrive, and how can we be a creature, a being on this planet that causes all other life to thrive. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. That was a perfect introduction. That was incredible. You previously talked in other talks about the central role played by the interbeing in your life, which I think is, very pertinent to this discussion, the kind of interconnected feeling center of the community. Can you just talk really briefly about that?
So this symbol that I keep here on my laptop, it actually has 4 colors, kind of hard to see in my bright light here, is the sacred hoop of life, we could say. It represents many different things, but it represents the nature of our situation, which is that we are interbeing, and that every life form has been given the honor of having a seat on the sacred hoop of life. And as long as every member upholds their part of the hoop, then the hoop you know, the integrity of the hoop remains. But if members stop fulfilling their perfect design for thriving life, then the integrity of the hoop begins to fail. And so that's what I believe that we're seeing right now. And I believe it's us that has lost track of how to uphold our role in maintaining the sacred hoop. And also our activities are preventing other members of this amazing life community from enacting their perfect design for thriving life. So ecologically, it's not working out well at all. But I'm gonna say that for me, it's also a moral dilemma, because what seems to me about this construct is that it requires us to honor the sovereignty of all beings, Everyone is crucial to the integrity of the whole.
Thank you. Now, on to our second speaker, Anne. Anne Johnson has so many impressive titles. I am a bit fearful of introducing you incorrectly. Anne is a professor, a dame, an epidemiologist, a renowned public health expert, and president of the UK Academy of Medical Sciences. Some of you might have heard her a few weeks ago, as I did, on the Jim Al-Khalili's Radio 4 series, The Life Scientific, which was absolutely brilliant, and where she talked about her pioneering work on the transmission of HIV in the 80s, the groundbreaking national sex survey that she established in the 1990s, and which rather reassuringly Thatcher railed against, and more recently her work researching the transmissibility of flu. Anne, how can we use the past to understand the future?
Well, thank you, Jess, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I'd just like to start by saying something in response to Pat, if that's okay. We talk now in public health, and I come from a medical background. We talk about planetary health, and that's a new concept, I think, for all of us in something which is very medicine is very focused on human beings, but I think the point that we're making is that we cannot thrive as human beings unless the planet thrives. And so we all have a responsibility going forward to nurture, as Pat has said, and I'm sure I think about it in a very different way, but we arrive at the same conclusion. That's what's so amazing, is that, you know, this is all about a planet and human life and all life being in harmony, because only that way will we actually have a sustainable future going forward. And there are so many challenges. None of that was where I was going to begin, but if I can begin where I was going to begin, I've studied epidemics all my life, pandemics, and all pandemics in a way arise from some social change or social disruption, socioeconomic and often sociopolitical disruption, and then they result in sociopolitical disruption going forward. And I think COVID will be no exception. And I wanted to go back to the fact that all these factors are the same. Pat was talking about, they're about the interaction. Pandemics are about the interaction between the biology of the organisms that cause them and patterns of human behavior, by and large, in different kinds of behavior. And I'll give you 3 examples. My mother was born in January 1919, right in the middle of the flu pandemic, the biggest pandemic maybe of all times in terms of human damage anyway. It came at the end of the First World War, which was of course globally disruptive, and it caused extraordinary global disruption, killing probably 50 to 100 million people around the world. And I've been reading Laura Spinney's book, Pale Rider, which talks about the flu pandemic, and I have it beside me. And as I was reading it, I turned down corners of the pages and underlined, I don't usually ruin books like this, underlined text, because it could have been written today. There's so many similarities in what's happening now to what happened then. And I'll give you some examples. The accentuation of inequalities, both nationally and globally. Arguments over interventions, arguments about mask wearing, remember that one? Arguments about and very different impact in different parts of the world. A terrible death rate which was actually worst in remote indigenous communities for the reasons that you've been talking about colonialism and so on. Longer term impacts on geopolitics, which she describes in great detail, and scientific arguments about origins still debated, causations, the search for effective treatments. And our science is much more advanced then, but actually ultimately the responses as they have in this pandemic have really relied a great deal on similar human behaviours. Fast forward 1919 to 1974, when I was a medical student, and I was very privileged to spend a year in Latin America, and even more privileged, I think, to be able to spend some time with the Yanomami people, indigenous people of the Orinoco Basin in Venezuela. And I think that was the first time I saw, scales from my eyes, was the impact that social change and can have on indigenous peoples. And indeed, in the 1950s and 60s, the Yanomami people who live in small communities in the rainforest were in a sense brought together, and then began to suffer the diseases of crowds. And they were brought together, of course, by trade and actually by missionaries and so on. They came down the river, and they were really very, very badly damaged, terrible death rates from measles, flu, whooping cough, diseases that they had never met. They were just like we are now in terms of COVID, completely susceptible to it. And that was very striking to me. In fact, I found it very overwhelming that the damage that we can cause to one another in many ways. And 10 years later, I started to study HIV, an infection which arose from an animal source, but of course was enabled by a lot of sociocultural change. Some we would now say for the good, some less for the good. So sexual lifestyles changed a great deal in the UK after the Second World War, with falling age at first sex, increasing numbers of partnerships, which drove sexually transmitted infection epidemics of gonorrhea and so on. There was, importantly, the decriminalisation of homosexuality, but there was tremendously persistent stigma around sexuality. Meanwhile, in parts of Africa where there was a terrible heterosexual epidemic, and there still is, we had issues, and you can think about the drivers of rural-urban migration, population movement, transactional sex, and various major sociocultural changes which facilitated spread. But HIV brought a whole bunch of things into focus. It brought sex and sexuality out of the closet, changed the way we talked and thought about sex. It led, I would argue, to the LGBTQ movement. It drove diversity and the inclusivity agenda. It drove actually the movement for patient participation, which is so important in care and research and the co-production of research. So too, COVID now highlights the inequalities in our society. It's shown us arguably new ways of working, one of which we're doing right now. It's underlined most of all our fragility in the face of a force of nature. Changed the way we communicate, opened our minds to the passing of seasons, highlighted the climate crisis, I think, and the consequences of environmental degradation, made us think about new ways of living and working, perhaps moving out of cities, of the challenges of high population density and globalization. We don't know now how it's going to change geopolitics in the long run, but it looks as if changes will be profound. I think the challenge is now is how do we learn from what's happening around us and build back better to a safer and better future, not just for us, but for the planet.
Perfect, thank you, Anne. I'll move straight on to Miranda now, because I'm so conscious that we need, 7 hours to discuss all of this, but we have another 35 minutes. Miranda Lowe is Principal Curator and Museum Scientist at the Natural History Museum, and has become known recently for her writing on decolonisation of natural history. She's recently been recognised for her science and museum work in the 2020 Women's Hour Power List, and is a specialist in marine invertebrates. Miranda, I just watched the talk you did about barnacles and their relation to the economy and was riveted. So how can we use the past to understand the future?
Well, I do that every day in terms of my curatorial practice. So for those that might not know, essentially what I do every day behind the scenes at the museum. So I spend part of my time looking down a microscope, doing marine research. So in terms of tiny microscopical organisms called amphipods in the ocean, and why they're really important. You mentioned the barnacle video as well in terms to the economy. So doing kind of the more traditional science stuff, looking down the microscope, but how that all impacts, and that's what we're here, impacts on the world and in terms of the economy, the food that we eat and how we source things, and caring about the environment a lot more. But the other side of things is actually, as a curator, I have the privilege to be responsible and curate historical collections. And so a lot of those, I spend a lot of time advocating for use of those historical collections to inform, so the past to inform the future, the environmental policies as well. But in more recent times, as you mentioned, and this is a couple of years ago now, but my paper, my co-authored paper, Nature Read as Black and White, Decolonizing Natural History, has been picked up again in the last year because, you know, well, a lot of things have changed for us completely, as Anne said. But in terms of my paper, what I wanted to expose is how can museums do better in terms of access to environmental data, to the collections, how they can be used. And because I work a lot, and we'll have Jeremy after me, but I work a lot with artists as well to give a different kind of understanding and access to the collections and the science that I do as well, because people can think that it's quite complex, and they feel powerless to do anything. And we're talking about, you know, planetary emergency. So my organisation, the Natural History Museum, has declared that some years ago now, and we want to create advocates for the planet. But I just want to go tap into something that Pat said, which does stem into my work on decolonising natural history. What I did with that paper and continue to do is to retell old stories, to recognise Indigenous people within the historical context of museums and collections of those specimens, and Indigenous knowledge that was used in the past, and how some of those, well, I do a lot of retelling of stories and reframing to give that recognition. And if cultural institutions are talking about that they want more diverse people to engage with their institutions, for people in a general sense globally to care about the planet, then these are some of the issues and the stories that they have to, we talk about Western science. There's not only that to be valued, but there is also the cultural value, the spiritual value, all what Pat's talking about, to recognise that and to look at things holistically, which is very important for us to all move forward to care about the planet. So I'll just leave it there because I know we need to have time for Jeremy and to have a full discussion.
Thanks, Miranda. And it's lovely the way you're all picking up on each other's disciplines and viewpoints. That's brilliant. Miranda, could I just ask, to what extent do you feel that the fact that we in the UK, and maybe you disagree with this, but have not come to terms with our past, how much is that holding us back and shaping a new future? And maybe you could answer in particular relation to museum collections or more broadly.
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question,
So,
Jess? Sorry.
I was just thinking, to what extent is the fact that we haven't come to terms with our past holding us back?
Well, I think at the time when I was talking about this, and then the paper came about from 2017 to 2018, I was very anxious about putting that information out there. So I felt at that point in time that it was very difficult for me in that space, and about cultural institutions accepting the past. I mean, over the last year, we've some of us have embraced it more fully than we've ever done before, and I think it will take a while, but that's why we're having this conversation now. And yes, it's been a very difficult journey for many of us, many people who look like me, for hundreds of years. And it's about putting yourself in other people's shoes in the conversation going forward,
Yeah.
I think.
Perfect. Now, Jeremy, sorry you've had to wait so long to speak, but let me just introduce you briefly. Jeremy Della is a Turner Prize winning artist working across many media, including video, installation and performance. He often works with communities beyond the confines of the visual art infrastructure and plays with different genres and cultural languages in works that grapple with historical, political events and power structures. And those works have included, rather fantastically, a reenactment of the Battle of Orgreave from the 1984 miners' strike, a bouncy castle designed to look like Stonehenge, a performance memorial to the soldiers of the First World War, and a US-wide tour of a destroyed car to elicit conversations with members of the public about the Iraq War. So, Jeremy, how can we use the past to understand the future? Or maybe more specifically in relation to your work, how has the past informed your work and how you understand the future?
Well, as a child, I was very interested in history. I loved history, but I hated how it was taught at school. I went to a private school where they taught a version of British history, which I didn't really recognize and didn't particularly enjoy. But I've always been interested in our shared history, maybe the social history of Britain, hence some of that work you described. And for me, personally, you could argue that all art is about the future in a way. It's definitely about the present. Even if you're making a work about the past, it's definitely about the time you're making it, and hopefully maybe about the future as well. So there's that. Of late, as soon as the lockdown started about this time last year, I just thought to myself, wow, we really need to have a kind of peace treaty with animals in a way. We really need to stop exploitation or treat them in a different way. And that's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. I've worked with bats a lot in the past. And so that's something I'm very interested in. And of course, bats, we don't know really what the source of this pandemic has been, but it's possible it might be those creatures. But I've always felt we should worship creatures rather than exploit them. And so I've come up, I had, if you can look on my Instagram, I came up with a thought about a post-pandemic memorial being a giant golden pangolin, for example. Sort of a jokey thing in a way, but maybe just opening that discussion again. So I am thinking about the future, and I do believe, I mean, I've said it before, but I think the greatest memorial to the Second World War was actually the NHS. And maybe in the future, we need to think about what the memorial might be for the people that have died in this pandemic. Maybe it is a park or a series of parks. It's something, it's a thing. It's not an object necessarily, but it's like an idea, Frank, in a way. So I'll just leave it at that because it's such an interesting panel. I feel actually quite sort of humbled to be here speaking amongst these people. Yeah,
I feel exactly the same. Imposter syndrome situation, but yeah, just to let everyone know, I think the Newsnight tomorrow night will be talking about a memorial to the I think it's 100 a year since the first death was announced of COVID-19. So, and I think that would involve artists. Maybe you, Jeremy, are involved. I don't know.
Not me. They should be talking to me.
Why did they not call you? I do not understand. Anyway,
I don't know.
It's a good point of discussion anyway. Okay, so let's get into that discussion. As I said earlier, if any of you watching would like to contribute their thoughts or questions, please do in the chat box. We'll get to that in about 10 minutes. So yeah, general questions. Given that the past, and I could maybe aim this at Pat or Miranda, but I think Anne or Jeremy could equally answer it. Given that the past is accessible to us primarily through a history that is full of gaps and power structures and lost voices, as Jeremy alluded to, a deeply problematic kind of narrative. How can we learn from what history doesn't tell us? You know, where can we sort of find those gaps and actually learn something from them? Pat, do you want to say something about that?
So I'm still learning what it means to retell the old story. That isn't as straightforward as it might sound. And all I can say is that, you know, the first example of an archetypal wounding of humanity that I was given was what took place during the so-called witch hunts in Europe. So on the surface of it, I think, well, first of all, what does this have to do with an indigenous woman from the Southwest of what we now call the United States? And how is this an archetypal wounding of all of humanity, right? And so what I found in accepting that was a good lead, a sound place to begin to retell an old story. What the process was really examining, what I always thought I knew about that story, which was that, if I'd just gone with my own instinct, I would have said, it's all about what those damn men did, and as soon as we bring that up, that word witch hunt, people immediately go to certain things. But as it turns out, what I discovered was that the sacred masculine was just as deeply violated as the sacred feminine was at that time, in terms of the violation of maybe a spiritual pact that we might say that the masculine holds, which is to uphold and protect life, the life bringer, the elders and the children. And they were set against themselves and their own spiritual archetype, you might say, at that time. But also what I learned was that was the destruction of indigenous Europe in many ways. And then it took hundreds of years, that breakdown, to break down the way of the circle in Europe and move it into the way of the power over paradigm, the pyramid. And so what was learned in that process was then put on those ships that ended up traveling to all parts of the earth. And those were the sons and grandsons of the men who were forced to watch the atrocities. And so that explains a little bit about what that behavior was about, in terms of colonization. So, going into that story, I didn't know any of those things. And so it expanded the story. It showed different kinds of interrelated aspects of our human story that I didn't know before. And so what happens is, one, compassion opens up in places that was pretty hard to come by. And also the possibility of healing and reconciliation for many. And so to me, I'll say what you brought up, Jeremy, is the power is in the present, ultimately. And the present is the building materials for what is going to take place. And so when we can come into a place of understanding about the depth of the interrelatedness, and also we can come into a place of compassion and a place of healing, self-healing and social structure healing, then we have a whole new set of material, I guess you could say, from which to create a future. So that's part of the story, but I have a feeling there's so much more to this retelling the old story.
Indeed, yes, thank you. And maybe linked to that, Anne, is there anything you think we haven't learned from previous epidemics that we should be considering now in light of COVID-19? Where are those kind of gaps?
Well, this is difficult stuff for me, actually, to think all this through, but I have a public health background, and I think one of the things that strikes me is that when we think about health, we tend very much to be stuck in this technology solution. And if you actually look at public health solutions, the people who have done a lot more for health, or have done as much health as all the medics and so on, are people like engineers who have built water and sanitation. I mean, these are solutions that we haven't yet managed to deliver around the world, that we have had access to since the 19th century. And yet we haven't delivered those things more globally. So now because we have at our fingertips new technologies, and I'm all for using these technologies appropriately, but often we don't use them in the most appropriate ways. And we're seeing many issues actually around how we use the technology revolution, in the same way that the Industrial Revolution brought huge opportunities and advantages, but it's brought huge problems, including the problems we face with with climate change, including, you know, all the problems of child labour and the damage that was done to people. So when I think about health, I tend to think of all the efforts we bring together in the health space. So if we want to move forward and cope with some of the big health problems we have going forward, which, you know, are inequalities starkly written, particularly now, those arise in socioeconomic disparities. Unless we tackle those alongside the benefits that come from modern science and modern technologies, vaccines, treatments, and so on, all of which, you know, we all want to have, but we need to make sure people can access them, but that we work also on the broader determinants of health, because thus far in this pandemic, we have been extraordinarily reliant on, you know, behavioral changes. These are not high technology changes, but they are, and we need also the collective enterprise and the ability on vaccines, for example, that nobody's safe till we're all safe, for example, but there is a much broader drawing of public health, which needs to be taken in the current context, learning from the past context of the public health revolution, for example, of the 19th century, which arose, we don't want to get into that, but you know, there's some very interesting questions about the political and socio-economic drivers which drove some of that public health movement, which, you know, there was a great deal of inequity, but there are other strange drivers which have parallels in many of the other things we're talking about here.
Thank you. We're going to go on to some of the questions from the audience in a minute, but can I just ask Jeremy, I think as you mentioned, a lot of your work is a sort of exploration of Britishness, and is there anything about our particular kind of characteristics that you think will dictate the way that we're able or not able to move forward, or to look back or forward? I don't know what you felt about the you know, the government announcement about monuments and planning permission. It was kind of deeply disturbing understanding of, you know, our past and our history. So maybe you could connect it to that.
Well, yes. I mean, it's like I said, the way I was taught history was basically how it's presented in the public realm. And the idea, there was this quote, it was obviously the banner headline in Daily Telegraph, and the word was, "You cannot airbrush history, so you have to keep the statues and the monuments up." But actually those statues and monuments are the equivalent of airbrushing, aren't they? They are the sort of 19th century equivalent of airbrushing, is to put a statue of someone up. So it's in a way, it's great that we're talking about it, and we're talking about the public realm. These aren't artworks necessarily, but they might be replaced by artworks, but there are solutions. There are many ways to approach it, and we don't have time to go into them. It's almost you know, it's another talk in a way, but I am hopeful that we'll come to something. But at the moment, the government realizes, I think, that it can probably win a culture war, or it's a war that it's actually quite comfortable waging, if you want to call it a war, or it's a debate that it knows it's comfortable waging just because it's a great distraction from other things, and so it appeals to a core audience. But I think that there are great possibilities actually for the future for this. So I'm confident we can resolve. It can be resolved, but it's all about teaching how history is taught at schools. Basically, that's the bottom line for me. From my experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, before we go on to the questions from the audience, is there anything that between you would like to ask each other? I'm kind of so aware of the fact that you all come from these different worlds, and that maybe it'd be nice to just bring some of those together directly without me intervening.
I guess, Anne, I'd love to have a really long conversation with you. These are really interesting points that you're bringing up. I think it's fascinating that, I mean, part of what you were saying a lot more than this, but just noticing that really a big part of our solutions in this pandemic are behavioral rather than scientific or technological. Isn't that interesting? So this is what my clan grandfather says, is that, you know, what we're suffering from at this moment is a crisis of relationship. And he was saying that pre-pandemic, but really that's what it is. How can we honor each other? How can we really step fully into this the ultimate three-legged race that we find ourselves in, you know, and that's actually the biggest factor in mediating and mitigating this pandemic. I just think that's a very interesting way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is so complicated because on the one hand, I think we had great hopes, and I have seen in communities, you know, it has been amazing how communities have come together, but we shouldn't get too, what's the word? We shouldn't lull ourselves into a sense of security, because it's also highlighted the terrible rifts we have in our society and the divisions we have in our society. And the economic impact is that the wealthy have got wealthier and the disadvantaged have become poorer. And that, you know, that's also something that we have to consider about our society, and that will have long impacts on health. And the fact that our children have been out of school is really important. So we have, I think, to pick up these pieces and think about the social interactions that we want to have together. And we need to reflect on what we can learn. Somebody's put a question in that the only question we learn from history is that we've learned no lesson. You know, I'm always very worried about lessons we're going to learn. But it is this integration of different approaches. I mean, I wouldn't be without the technologies, and I wouldn't be without the science that we've learned in this pandemic. Myself, I'm really glad we have a vaccine, but as you know, a technology is one thing, it's the shiny object, but it's how we use it and deliver it that matters as a society, that actually is what makes the difference. And of course, all the ruckus about test and trace is a good example. One of the things, Jess, I've been saying endlessly on the radio, the test itself doesn't really help. It's what you do as a result of it, which actually is a sort of self-isolation, which requires a degree of self-sacrifice, of course, individually, but you're doing that for some other collective good, of which you're part of that collectivity. And I don't know how that's well above my ability to think how that plays out at large, but those are the big questions we have as a society, that we are doing things for ourselves, but we are also doing them for the collectivity when you take on big issues like climate change.
Jess, can I just pick up something across what Pat and Anne have just been discussing? Because Anne, I think in your previous conversation, when you were discussing about health inequalities, it made me think about, you know, the thing has been in the last year, people kind of wanting to access nature a lot more, talking about their mental health, and then, you know, how good nature is for that. And I've been watching a number of art programs, in particular late night, you know, about tree hugging and things like that. But the inequality that occurs in terms of access to nature and land, indigenous peoples, but also the current discussions in the UK, you know, of people that look like me not feeling confident to go out there into the countryside, and those that do, that group together to have countryside walks, that, you know, that there has been a lot of, well, it fits under the banner of this crisis of relationships, that being made to feel unwelcome in particular groups. So they're going in groups with people that look like themselves to aid, you know, that comfort. And if it's your first time of doing anything such as rambling or walking, you know, just an introduction into that space has caused a lot of, you know, controversy at the moment. So again, I think that kind of access to nature and green spaces and the socioeconomics of it, those that live in high-rise blocks that don't have those parks and gardens near them or whatever, or probably least likely, although we can't all go out into the countryside at the moment, but when we do, it's that there's an inequality there, which then could impact on your health as well as getting medicines and treatment. So I think anyway, there's a lot to be discussed there, but it's something.
Absolutely. You know, you've just made a very important point that people talk about people making lifestyle choices. Well, what you've just said, you don't have a choice to go outside if there isn't a park nearby and you're in a high rise without a garden. So we need to think about, we shouldn't be talking about individual choices. We should be talking about facilitative environments. And the same thing relates to discussion about obesity. And we know that's very unequal, but that's all very much related to food systems and people's opportunities to access food, which is more nutritious, it's also related to income and access to food, the amount of time you've got to cook it, the amount of you've learned how to, I mean, all these things are unequally distributed and they confound one another. And there are, a lot of varied interests out there, which we could discuss about who has access to those choices. And they do relate to where we started in on this conversation.
Okay, we're going to jump in here and just address some of the questions in the chat box. There's one here from Marisha Lewandowska, Jeremy, directed at you. Can you speak more about the question of entitlement when it comes to representing history?
Entitlement. In terms of who gets to represent history? I mean, in Britain, we are obsessed with our history, aren't we? If you visited Britain and just turned on TV, you'd think the Second World War had only finished last week or still going on. We absolutely love it. And I think on the whole, it's usually people who had a certain kind of education that have been telling the stories. You only have to see that when you watch telly, until maybe recently. And just going back to that idea about history, how it's taught in schools, if I may, you might think, oh, that's just not important the way history is taught in schools. It's just another subject. It's not as important as the STEM subjects. But, I went to school. The school I went to, 2 years above me in my school, was Nigel Farage. And he was taught history in the way I was taught history by the same people, the same syllabus. And he believed it. He swallowed it. And he's sort of reflecting that back on us, or he has been for the last 10 years, 15 years. So it really does matter. And I suppose when I was at school as well, we were told we were the best in Britain, and Britain was the best in the world, and the history reflected that. So that's, from childhood onwards, is a sort of form of mild brainwashing, you could argue.
Yeah, and that's something that has come across so powerfully over the last year in the sort of wake of the Black Lives Matter protests. I think it's been a pretty extraordinary kind of series of events and unlearning since then. And I think I'm about your age, Jeremy, and I feel like my education was powerfully damaging rather than in any way even neutral or constructive. And I just feel I have to go through these just ongoing kind of relearning my roots, my responsibilities, my agency, everything. And I'm just right in the middle of it now. It's quite an extraordinary process. It will not stop, I'm sure. Okay, let's have a look at any of the other questions. The big problem of our modern society is that we feel we are separated from nature, as lots of you have discussed, but it's just the opposite. We are interrelated and our DNA is the same. And only when human beings understand that, then nature will not be an obstacle. I don't know if anyone wants to pick up on that. So we are interrelated. That's what Pat especially has said. And our DNA is the same. And only when human beings understand that, then nature will not be an obstacle. Anne, is there anything you want to?
Well, I would, yes, for sure. That's the building blocks of all of us. Also the building blocks of what's just overwhelmed us. It's a virus. And, nature's out there. The forces of nature are out there. Climate change is a force of nature. And we need to treat these things with respect. I mean, yes, we're animals. We're animals like all the other animals, and we're in this together with all the other animals, plants, bugs, and all the rest of it. And if we tip the balance the wrong way, we're all in trouble. So there are many forces out there that I feel we need to treat with the greatest of respect and pay attention more to them. And it's fantastic that people have had time at home to think a bit more about some of these things. Maybe that will allow us to be more thoughtful going forward and recognise that we can't separate ourselves because we're able to invent and drive tech and everything forward. that doesn't separate us fundamentally from the need for a sustainable environment to live in.
Can I just say, I think it's kind of interesting just thinking about it, that people's relationships with their pets, especially their dogs, has been like a really big deal during this pandemic. And maybe that's where people get spiritual comfort from nature from. And because you do see it.
Absolutely, it's been pretty incredible to see that over the last year. Miranda, I've just looked through the other Q&A box on YouTube. There's loads more questions. This could definitely go on for a very long time. Can Miranda and other panelists, maybe just Miranda at this point, talk about decolonisation of natural history collections in 1 minute?
Well, I can suggest that they read my paper.
Yeah, I think, you know what, I think that's a brilliant idea. I don't know if the Invisible Dust team, Lydia maybe has put that in the chat box, but I would really recommend it. It's a really important, very, very useful read. But maybe just give us one example, just very briefly.
About where it all started for me was within the Hinsey Hall of the museum. So we've got 162 botanical ceiling panels, and one of them represents a plant called Quassia amara, and the untold story or the hidden history behind that panel was actually a previously enslaved a person called Graman Quasi, who knew all about the medicinal properties in Suriname. So he was a healer doctor within Suriname, and he would use the medicinal properties of that plant. But the interesting thing about revealing that story was not only that it was a person of colour that discovered those properties, but then how that information became more widely known within Europe. So it was a student of Carl Linnaeus, who is known as the person who popularized the naming of plants and animals, a Swedish botanist. So that the recipe and a sample of the plant came back to Europe to Carl Linnaeus, who later described it. And as I say, the rest is history, because if you follow that through, the chemistry and the medicinal properties, so that went into pharmacology, and we're still using elements, and Anne could probably talk about that to no end today. So I just like talking about those things to make people realize that on the one hand, you've got all this science and nature and this person, Carl Linnaeus, and then on the other, oh yes, and Carl Linnaeus named the plant in honor of Graman Quasi, and you don't find that so easily, so often. So yeah, that's just a short end of it.
That was perfect. Okay, so we have to bring this to a close. It's literally felt like 4 minutes. It's very weird. There are quite a few themes that came out across all of your discussion points and presentations, and I think a lot of them obviously related to inequality, but also the importance of storytelling, which links really nicely to one of the Invisible Dust discussions that was held yesterday evening, in particular Joan Jonas's comments about myth making and the importance of myth making in stories in this conversation. Lots of things that Pat said that I think we all need to really take home, especially your grandfather, through our crisis of relationship. I think, we all have to come to terms with that. And cultural and political and spiritual value, these are all things that are just so important, and compassion at the end of all of it all is compassion. So we have to bring this to a close, but I just want to thank all of the speakers so much for their input. It's been really amazing. And also just to say that these events will be going on for the next 24 hours, and there will be a pass to be able to watch any events that you haven't been able to attend over the weekend. So do have a look and see what else the Invisible Dust team have been planning. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.